Sucker Punch is a game studio that I feel doesn't get as much credit as other Western first-party Sony studios. When people think Sony, they think of the creative enjoyment of Insomniac games, the grand and epic scope of Santa Monica Studios, and the narrative joyrides of Naughty Dog. But it seems like Sucker Punch is just left off to the side, despite them also making just as great games as their contemporaries. Their newest game, Ghost of Tsushima, is just another great example of showing how good of a game company Sucker Punch really is. Granted, there are still a ton of people who enjoy and love their games, but it always seems whenever they announce a new game, it's not usually, "Oh, this is Sucker Punch's newest game! Awesome!" And more like, "Oh, a new Sucker Punch game. Neat." At least, that's what I see. I was never planning on doing a review for this. I was just going to play it and move on, especially since I have another video I felt was more interesting that I am also working on. But I have so many thoughts on this game, and I want to express them. So, time to go full Japanese film weeb and review Ghost of Tsushima. (1274) Tsushima, an island off to the side of Japan, is being invaded by the Mongolians. 80 samurai stand against the Mongolian army, and suffice to say, they fail miserably. Lord Shimura is taken hostage by Khoten Khan, and all of the samurai are presumed dead, except for Jin Sakai. He is saved by the thief Yuna, and Jin decides to take the Khan head on. It goes about as well as you'd expect. Now Jin must find a way to save his uncle and save Tsushima, but in turn he must forego everything he knows to beat this new enemy. The story is really good. It's not groundbreaking in any way, and given that the main plot structure is similar to that of a typical samurai movie, a lot of elements are easily predictable, but they're still handled in a great way, and the story is all the more engaging for it. The best aspect of the story is seeing how the Mongol invasion leads to change in the main cast, especially Jin. He goes from generic honor before reason samurai to being a more pragmatic warrior who will do anything he can to take down his enemies, while protecting the people of the island, and becoming less stoic in his emotions, and more natural. Granted, this is fairly basic, and I think that other character storylines and arcs are way more interesting than Jin's, but aren't side characters usually more interesting than the main character in anything anyway? For example, the villain. He doesn't go through any changes, but there are two important factors to his character that keep him from being just a generic villain. 1. He is used to show that historically, Mongols are actually strategists and would actually study their enemies through and through before attacking. They weren't just brutes who couldn't think and just attacked. Nowhere is this more prevalent than in the Khan's introduction. Yes, he is brutal, but he is pragmatic. Why just attack someone randomly? Why not throw alcohol on an enemy then burn him? Or mock the leader of your opposing force by saying how you know their culture so well that they didn't even stand a chance.
But while you were sharpening your sword, do you know how I prepared for today? I learned. I know your language, your traditions, your beliefs, which villages to tame and which to burn.
Smart villains and historically accurate villains aren't anything special, but it's hard for me to think off the top of my head of both being used at the same time, and being used well, too. 2. Besides all of the murdering, and conquests, and torture, and arson, and kidnapping, he's actually a pretty chill and charismatic guy.
You must be thirsty. Areg. Milk from my favorite horse. The final gift to me. She broke her egg yesterday, so I fed her to my men. We do what we must, Lord Sakai. That is why you and I are both survivors.
I am samurai.
No, you are more than that. You are the ghost. Convince your people to join me, and I will give them peace.
We will never serve you.
Your uncle said the same thing when I asked him to end this war.
He refused to be your slave.
I too have pride in family. And I know what it's like to live in their shadow. Why should we settle for scraps when we deserve to be legends?
He is a legend.
See? Your people will follow you. Join me and save them.
You want to divide and conquer? You did it to Ryuzo. Not us.
The character development and character moments are what really make the story work, but some plot points or special moments here or there really hit hard. It's hard to explain how without going into spoilers, but trust me, the story for the game is very well done. The message is also relevant, but presented in a way that works for the time period as well. Bushido and the honorable way of the samurai may have worked for a time, but when your enemy knows how it works and exploits it, it would be more harmful and downright stupid to just stick to that and think it's still going to work. Adapting to the situation and changing your tactics is the right way to go, but you also have to remember not to take things too far and just end up becoming exactly what you are fighting. In the case of the game, it's Bushido versus... let's not beat around the bush. It's ninjutsu. Jin becomes a ninja. Which way is truly the right way? And nobody is truly right or wrong, and there's no easy answer. This is a timeless lesson, though. Things worked at one point for a reason. Hell, sometimes things may still work that way. But if it doesn't work well anymore, it seems foolhardy to keep things the way they are, and change is needed. That being said, change it too much, or change things in the wrong way, and more problems can occur that could be even worse. There's a happy medium somewhere, but it is difficult to find due to opposing beliefs and traditions. So long story short, yes, the story is good. Enough of the ethic talk. So the graphics of the game... well, let's say this first. The base character models and building textures and the like are just fine. They're good, but nothing amazing looking. In fact, the character models look a little bit like plastic, so while they look good, they're not amazing. That being said, the environments are gorgeous. And the lighting effects, dear lord, the lighting effects are incredible. This game shows off the beautiful and incredibly varied landscape of the island, and each area is incredibly photo-esque. No matter the time of day or night or sunrise or sunset, it all looks amazing. You have areas like Kishi Grasslands, the Golden Forest, Kubara, Field of the Equinox Flowers, all the beach and snow areas, and even more locations I haven't listed. They all look stunning. Not every area is a home run in terms of looks or visuals, but the environments are so good overall, and the way the sun or moon illuminates the areas gives everything a great silhouette, or just makes the color pop even more. The only problem is that sometimes the intense lighting could hide something in the environment, or there may even be times where your objective just so happens to be in front of the sun, and you can't see anything. So while the base graphics are fine, the environmental ones are terrific. That being said, on the other end of the visual side, the animations are hit or miss, which is kind of par for the course for a Sucker Punch game. Cutscenes are animated just fine, and things like running and certain kill animations are good, but things like the hand-animated lip movements and even basic attack animations are not really up to par. They're not awful, but there's a clear and distinct difference, which is kind of bad for the attack animations since that is something you never stop seeing. I don't know why this is something they've always struggled with, but it's present in this game as well, although not as blatant in this game as others. Noticeable, but not the worst. So for the gameplay, there are three main areas to talk about, those being exploration, combat, and stealth. Let's start with exploration. This is an open world game. We can always see something to do in the distance and... how did that get there? Anyway, exploration is where you get your main bit of platforming, since while you can jump whenever and climb many surfaces, jumping on its own isn't going to kill Mongols. You can only climb certain kinds of ledges, but the game is still generous in what you can and can't climb. At a certain point, you gain a grappling hook, which allows you to become Japanese Spider-Man. I guess more accurately, Samurai Spider-Man, then? The climbing works well for the most part, but once again, a long-lasting issue Sucker Punch has always had is still there. That being the way a grab tracks to a ledge, or in some cases, doesn't. When you jump to a ledge or a tree branch, the automatic tracking works most of the time, but there are times where you jump to a branch and somehow jump over it, or jump close to a ledge and Jin won't grab it or grabs the wrong one. In the overworld, it's not a big deal, but for platforming challenges, it is a gigantic pain in the ass, and I can't believe that a problem that's been around since the PS2 is still prevalent here. As for the other main mechanic, riding your horse, I don't know, it's riding a horse. It's hard to fuck that up. It works fine. I'm glad it has teleporting powers though, since it would be very inconvenient and irritating if it didn't. The combat is the most in-depth aspect of the game. The square button is your quick attack, and the triangle is your heavy attack, mainly used to break defenses. You can also hold down triangle for a stronger move, but the move is usually slow and has a lot of wind-up. Circle is used to quick dodge, and L1 is used to block and parry. Where the real complexity comes in is the stance system. You have a multitude of stances used for certain situations and enemies where... Seriously? Again? Anyway, the stone stances are used for certain enemies and changes your moves for each as well. You have 4 stances. Stone stance is the best against normal sword wielders, although I find its heavy attack the most useless out of all the stances since it is stupidly slow, and it rarely ever seems to do much to an enemy's defenses. The water stance works best against shield enemies. Wind stance works the best against spear users. The moon stance works the best against brutes. While the basic combat isn't complex, the need to switch between stances to not get overwhelmed is where the real challenge and complexity come in. You really need to be on your toes and constantly switch between the stances in order to best deal with the enemies. It is a thrill when you aren't getting overwhelmed, and really shows how skilled Jin is as a swordsman, and how skilled the player can be when adapting to the fight. The combat is really fun and works well. The problem in combat isn't so much you yet, but your enemies, namely that the variety is kind of lacking. You have the aforementioned swords, spear, brutes, and shield enemies, but you also have archers, and that's it. You do get one more type of enemy in Act 2, but it's just a harder to manage sword user, and by Act 3 there's nothing new. So they just throw a lot of enemies at you to make up for the fact that combat gets dull by this point. It's fun for 2/3 of the game, but gets boring by the end. That being said, there are a couple of major issues with the actual combat as well though, like I mentioned earlier. That being the lack of a manual lock-on and the unblockable attack frames. The game has a soft lock-on so that you'll always attack the nearest enemy that you are pointed at. Like climbing though, the tracking is sometimes off, which can get infuriating when there are a lot of enemies on screen and Jin keeps attacking the enemies you currently aren't focused on. It would have been nice to be able to know exactly which one you're attacking and not have attacks whiff because it loses tracking of one enemy or tries to track another one. This is also a problem with bosses. While I'll cover bosses later on, the problem persists there too, even though it's only one enemy and the camera is focused only on them. You can still whiff attacks on a singular enemy, which is very problematic. As for the unblockable attacks, it makes sense that unblockables will be difficult to deal with, but it is always unclear when you're supposed to dodge, and it seems to change for every single enemy. Sometimes you dodge as soon as you see a red flash, sometimes you have to wait until the attack gets close to connecting, and it seems to change every time. It could be just me, but there are times where I'll dodge an enemy attack, but in a later group, where the same enemy attacks, and I dodge at the same time, I still get hit. I don't believe you have invincibility frames, so the dodge is a real dodge with a hitbox, but it makes it hard to tell if you dodge correctly or not in some cases. I have no problem with hard to read unblockables, and although the lack of invincibility frames is annoying, it is doable. What I don't like is the inconsistency on the prompt and how the timing always seems different, which again is hard to handle in large crowds. So the combat does have a challenge with having to constantly switch between styles and dealing with a large variety of enemies at a time, and overall is fun. But the variety of enemies is lacking. A manual lock-on is sorely needed to be able to focus on enemies without jumping between enemies when you don't intend to, and more clear dodge windows would be greatly appreciated. There are 2 quick things I want to mention about combat before going on to the next gameplay segment. The standoff mechanic and the ghost stance. The standoff mechanic is a cool way to thin out enemies without having to fight much. You hold in a triangle button, and when the enemy attacks, you do a quick draw, instantly killing the opponent. You can also kill anywhere from 3 to 5 enemies depending, meaning that if you have a group of 3 to 5 enemies, challenge them to a standoff, and succeed, you just took all of them out in one hit and didn't really have to break a sweat. like a true samurai. Also, it is a terrific mix of cinematic gameplay. It's cinematic as all hell, but it's not automated. You have to time it well, unless you want to take damage or be almost insta-killed. The other thing I want to touch on is the ghost stance. It's not like the other stances in the game. You build up a meter by killing 7 enemies in a row without taking damage, or if you kill a general. You then press in L3 and R3, and now you have a temporary insta-kill mechanic for up to 3 enemies. It's just another way to thin out enemies, although it does look cool. I do wish it was a little more brutal to justify enemies becoming scared and to show how violent Jin is becoming, but it's a novel mechanic, if not the most useful. Finally, the stealth, which for a game where the first bit of gameplay for the game tease was stealth, implying it would be important, it's kinda lackluster. Melee-wise, you can kill enemies by stabbing them normally, attacking from the air, attacking from behind doors, chain attacks, and that's it. Yeah, that's really it for basic stealth kills. It's really lacking in that regard. I feel like the stuff like that is fine starting out, but you should get more options as you upgrade, like corner kills, great kills, ledge kills, so on and so forth. I do like the little detail that starting out, your stealth kills are long and inefficient. Then as you upgrade your weapons, you get quicker, but still brutal kills, to Jin just shanking them and moving on, showing his growth and proficiency as stealth kills. The melee aspect of stealth works just fine, but still missing features that should have also existed and upgraded as you play on. What is good for stealth is all of your ghost weapons and your ranged weapons. You can use bow and arrows to quietly snipe enemies, kunai for a quick hit/stun, powder bombs to stun enemies, smoke bombs to make a quick getaway or just to blind enemies for a bit, wind chimes to lure enemies to a specific location, and different types of poison. These are very varied and make up for the lack of stealth kills. They have multiple functions and are all useful in their own ways. The problem is, while some items can kill, others are just distractions, and since items are limited, stealth all leads back to stabbing them anyway. Also, the AI in these sections are some of the worst I've ever seen in stealth sections. Not only do they have a set pattern, making it easy to abuse and exploit them, they could easily lose track of you even if you are directly in front of them. I guess it's better than making them unfairly difficult, but the AI isn't great. Stealth overall is not awful, it works perfectly fine, but more could have been done. I feel like they could have implemented the grapple hook into the stealth too, though. It's only useful for traversal, but it could be a brutal scare tactic for the Mongols if used as a stealth kill item too. Missed opportunity, I guess. The music in this game is something that this time around I don't have much to say compared to other reviews. The soundtrack uses a lot of Japanese instruments, of course, but there's no track that really popped or stuck with me. There are some songs I remember, but only because they may have played a lot, like the haiku music. I wouldn't say it's a bad soundtrack. In fact, I usually like this kind of music in some cases, but it wasn't particularly memorable. Nothing stands out to me in particular, but it's a pleasant sound, so it's fine. The bosses in this game are interesting. Whether it's a good interesting or a bad interesting is up to a personal perspective. Visually, the boss fights are fucking fantastic. Most of them are presented as a standoff, perfectly fitting a samurai duel. The wind will be all dramatic. It's all tense as we wait for both to draw their weapons. Hell, some actually have scripted weather moments, like the fight with Koga. This is a good example of games becoming more cinematic. For the most part, when games choose to be more cinematic experiences, they forget the actual game part. But this game has a perfect balance of cinematic moments and just being a goddamn video game! The locations for a good amount of them also look like they could be locations for the final battle in a samurai film, so it is presented in an amazing way as well. Not all are like this, since the Mongols don't care about epic cinematic fights, and some of the locations, like I stated in the visual section, are in more bland areas. But in general, boss fights visually look great, especially if you happen to have great lighting with certain times of the day. Mechanic-wise, well, it's a little weak. Not awful, but underwhelming. The camera is moved closer to Jin, and is also focused on just the one enemy, making it easier to handle than, say, a bunch of enemies with a close camera. Essentially, though, it is a fight against a normal type of enemy, but they might have more moves and harder to read patterns. It helps make it more unique, and does make it fit as a boss and not just an elite enemy. But when you get to the point where some enemies function like this normally anyway, it blurs the line. There is one fight that kind of subverts this by the fact that the boss has a different weapon and a different moveset than anyone else, and later switches the way the boss fight is done entirely differently to test out more than just your dueling skills and to test your skills against Mongols and to use your ghost abilities. But like I said, only one boss in the whole game changes things up, and the rest are functionally the exact same. These fights can be difficult though if you just bum rush it, so you have to play cautiously and attack when there's an opening, or after you break their guard, or parry at the right moment. And I like that you have to play like a smart fighter and not a desperate bum rusher. However, the normal lock-on issues that I mentioned earlier are here, which is egregious in this case when there are no other enemies, yet you can still lose lock-on. So the boss fights on a visual level are very well done, but on a mechanic level is pretty hit and miss. The side missions in the game are a definite highlight. You have some basic ones, sure, but quite a good amount of them are unique with their own objectives and storylines that— GOD DAMN IT! Anyway, yeah, the tales are the side missions of the game that deal with your allies, and they have their own storylines, some honestly being more interesting than the main plot at times. It's also interesting that while the main story has boss fights, most of the boss fights in the game come from side missions and side objectives. While some stories are dragged out a little longer than they need to be, they are all a nice change of pace from the normal side missions, and even the main plot should that not be good enough. You also have mythic quests, side missions that grant new combat abilities or new weapons or armor. They offer quite the unique challenge and can change the tide of battles, such as giving you a realistic version of Judgment Cut, or allowing you to light your sword on fire. This is also where the staple Sucker Punch artsy cutscene comes in. Like Sly Cooper and its cartoon-like cutscenes are infamous with its comic book-like cutscenes. These ones present a story through Japanese paintings, and they are really beautifully done. And while the normal side content can get repetitive and some of the tales can drag, all the mythic quests provide unique and fun challenges that I never got sick of. If they actually added more, it might be a problem, so they are perfectly paced and placed too. The fact that the side missions were actually given thought and effort put into them is a nice change of pace for me, since besides a couple of games, I'm used to side missions just being used to pad game time, but not here, which is great. One last thing I have to mention is that if you're like me and you have to complete every part of the island before you move on, the game can get incredibly repetitive and boring. Things like fox dens or shrines or liberating towns and villages never fundamentally change, and there are so many of them that can be boring going from place to place and completing them. Thankfully, the side missions and story help to make things interesting and enjoyable, and if you don't really care about completing everything in the game, it might work better. So if you have OCD, the game will definitely drag from doing the same shit over and over, but otherwise, if you are a normal human being, the pace of the game doesn't drag too often, and is enjoyable throughout. Overall, this is a very good game. There are some hiccups here or there when it comes to things like combat, stealth, and bosses, but with how high the quality of the story and visuals are, and how the base combat is still good despite its flaws, plus the myriad of other positives I already mentioned, the entire package is great all around. I give this game an 8.5 out of 10. A storm is coming. Granted, this is fairly basic, and I think that other character storylines and arcs are way more interesting than Jin's, but aren't signed characters... signed characters, okay. 2. Besides all of the murdering, and conquests, and torture, and arson, and kidnapping, he's actually a pretty chill and... Bushido and the Honorable Way of the Samurai may have worked for a time, but when your enemies know how it works and exploits it, it would be more what the fuck? These are very varied. And very varied. Very varied. Oh boy, that's gonna be tough to do. These are very varied. Okay, let's take that slowly.